evening, everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's talk. We honor to have with us Professor Lina Franken, a distinguished scholar whose work sits at the intersection of digital humanities and cultural studies. Since 2022, Professor Franken has helped chair digital humanities and cultural studies at the University of Göttingen. Before that, she served as an active professor of sociology with a focus on computational social sciences at the LMU Munich from 2021 to 2022. From 2018 to 2021, she was a research associate and project coordinator for the collaborative research initiative Automated Modeling of Hermeneutic Processes, also known as HEP, at the University of Göttingen. Prior to that, she contributed to the BMBF for the project Culture in Teacher Education at the University of Göttingen, where she focused on cultural education and teaching this courses. Research brings a critical and reflective lens to the digital transformation of the humanities. Today, she will be speaking to us on the topic testing, exploring, infrastructuring, the critical reflexive perspective on digital practices within the humanities. So we are happy to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the introduction and the invitation to present aspects of my ongoing research today. Since I'm not as fluent in English, I'll stick to a text, so I hope this works out fine. I will do something untypically for digital humanities and not talk about a project, but rather form a broader perspective on practices within digital humanities and how they transform academic work. Since I am a cultural anthropologist by training, I have studied these developments empirical and want to give you an insight. And I have to admit that some of my sources that I present today are in German, since most of my research was conducted in Germany, but I hope everyone will understand the context. If not, please feel free to interrupt and ask questions whenever you want to. So, okay, I think I don't have to tell you this, but the present is digitally permeated. Digitality is often not even consciously perceived anymore. In theorizing, this phase is referred to as post-digital. After many other terms, there's a talk of the computational turn of the present as a culture of digitality, or a more than human, more than digital present. These analytical perspectives are united by the fact that digital data, algorithms, and devices are omnipresent, but they are disappearing and are taken for granted, even in research. In the following, I take a critical, reflexive, hopefully, perspective on the digital practices of researchers. I use the triad of testing, exploring, and infrastructuring. But before that, I briefly discuss digital practices in general and conclude with critical, reflexive perspectives and an outlook. So, scientific practices have long been digital. Be it literature research or the annotation of texts, or the data collection and analysis, and here it's empirical data collection. This is currently this is constantly changing and currently being transformed, especially with generative AI. I think I don't have to tell you that. These scholarly information practices or scholarly primitives are usually implemented in digital manual work, which I refer to as computer-aided but manual. Research today usually involves the use of digital algorithms, data, tools, devices, and platforms. These help to shape research processes in human-technology relations. We have to keep in mind that data is always context-dependent and process-based. At the same time, algorithms are human-made and to be researched in various dimensions, not limited to the code itself, but including the broader perspectives of different actors involved in producing and performing code. Human-computer interaction therefore plays a central role here. I'll come back to this later. Digital practices are shaped differently in communities of practice, in the humanities and cultural studies, which are exemplified here by specialist German associations. Both digital and non-digital fields of research are investigated. Digital practices are increasingly taken for granted, although different epistemic cultures exist in parallel, and epistemic cultures I refer to as cultures of knowledge production. Specific digital practices are emerging, which are more than human, but also more than digital. This epistemological plurality also comes with methodological plurality, for which we need diversity in the tools and instruments, as well as in the data with which research is conducted. Digital humanities, like others, do digital manual work. However, they extend research with computational approaches. The community actively shapes its knowledge productions with computer code, software, infrastructure, data, metadata. Before I go into the associated practices in more detail, a few words about my methodological approach. In a computational extended discourse ethnography, as I call it, I examine the transformation of research practices in the digital medium. Based on an auto-ethnographic observation of my own practices, I have engaged in participatory observations and extended my methods to code and data ethnography. In the process, I quickly became aware of the relevance of computer code and data in their relations to each other. I have ethnographically accompanied 2 digital humanities research projects more intensively, and currently 2 grant applications I'm reviewing in order to continue this with a broader focus, so keep your fingers crossed. In the discourse analysis part, I use computational methods to find and filter my sources. I conduct interviews with researchers from different communities, not only digital humanities, currently together with Lina Franken, and in workshops with Dennis Möbers, I push forward the exploration of data with digital practices. From the very beginning on, another focus has been the reflection of changing knowledge production, currently especially on AI in educational settings, in a project with colleagues from media studies at University of Göttingen, Franco Rau and Ann-Kathrin Bock. I conduct this ongoing research with a changing focus at the field, since the field is so diverse and fast-moving. The concept of polymorphous engagement is helpful here, as it reveals both changes in research practices and necessary innovations in traditional methods. Nevertheless, the interdisciplinary perspectives needed make it obvious to collaborate with the researchers whose practices I study. So it's a kind of engaged research. And my own digital practices, therefore, are determined by testing, exploring, and infrastructures, as well as those within the field. So these reflections lie one level above my concrete use and further development of computational methods, for example, in the reuse of interview transcripts or in the curation-driven research approaches, which take into account research questions that are answered with the data digitized and indexed as cultural heritage data. I will elaborate on these research structures in more detail within the upcoming Digital Humanities International Conference next month. So if you're there, you can see each other. Today, my focus is on the practices of digital humanists. Research processes in the humanities and cultural studies are extended in the digital humanities, and they get more fragmented. New practices include thinking in models, operationalizing individual steps, and structuring data on different scales than the classical humanities and cultural studies do. So let us first look at testing, the methodological side. Computational methods are described as experimental, as performative, and closely associated with ambivalences and ambiguities. However, this part of research often becomes invisible in the result, even though it is a constitutive element of digital practices in everyday research work. It is about tinkering, which means continuously testing on which methods are helpful for which questions, which data levels, and which levels of knowledge are needed. Andreas Fickers has linked this to thinking into the term thinkering. So what changes in testing when digital data is processed in order to make it algorithmically accessible? In an ethnographic zoom-in, let us take a look at this with the example of Stefan, whose name I change as it is common in ethnographic work. I'm in the wrong direction, sorry, there's Stefan. He recently completed his PhD in Digital Humanities. I have discussed with Stefan several times what's changing through digital practices. In the course of his doctoral thesis, he learned the basics of Python, programming with the help of internet tutorials and colleagues, not with courses at the university because he only started to learn it at PhD level, in order to make his own calculations with data. Actually, he started with Excel sheets. This gives him an overview of the content. For example, which topics occur within the material and where, so it's topic modeling, or how emotionally charged texts are, so sentiment analysis. Stefan is convinced that tables and visualizations are research results because, and I quote him, a well-prepared corpus is already full of scientific findings. This is an important result, he emphasized when I asked whether interpretation of the source material is needed. No, the analysis has a value of its own, even if you don't read the text yourself, he answers me. To provide more context, he works with material that has already been analyzed by generations of researchers. Stefan sees his entry into digital humanity via the use of tools as different from classic humanities disciplines, and I quote him again, where you still have to read those introductory books. He argues that you can always do the theoretical grounding afterwards. Looking back, he acknowledges that he first acquired skills in using tools and programming before developing a more quantitative interest in the thematic outcomes. Stefan's talks and publications focus on testing promising computational possibilities for a problem. He develops models of his research problems for measuring the world and operationalize them in the process. Testing is omnipresent in these practices. Stefan tests different settings, he looks at the results, changes the settings, looks at the results again, and goes back and forth until results and research questions fit together. His interest is shifting away from the content-related findings towards tinkering, towards testing what is possible with the computational metrics he uses. Interpretation and analysis are nevertheless inherent to the selection and combination of methods applied. Calculating rather is a form of testing and playful recombination. Another digital humanist called this, described his research as follows. I just like to stand in the craft workshop and tinker. Stefan puts this like this. You can control your knowledge process more and make it more comprehensible. This also goes hand in hand with continuous testing and modification, tinkering, just like in a craft workshop. In German, it is Werkstatt. Decision-making takes place in shared practices of researchers and code. Oh, this is wrong. Sorry. But there they are. The researchers code the machine on which it runs, the data that is processed. And in addition, other entities such as colleagues, but also annotations or metadata play a role. He himself puts this quite differently when talking to me, pointing out that the epistemological process become much more controllable and reproducible. He's not aware that there are his own pre-assumptions and biases that play a role in the way he tinkers with the inputs and results, that his own entanglements are of high relevance for the outcome. The community of practice consists not only of digital humanists, but also of the assemblage that can be understood within Trona as an algorithmic assemblage, or with Kitchen and Loriot as data assemblage. Research is thus open, incomplete, and fragmented. Let me dive into another ethnographic example. Another zoom in order to form a broader perspective. Digital Humanities working group consisting of PhD students from different disciplines that were grouped together by their supervisors in order to develop new ideas on the age approaches to specific fields. Andrea, as I call her here, is a traditionally trained linguist that learned her first bits of Python code early in her PhD research in order to better code the structures of language she's researching. When she joined the group, she made use of these first steps in broader contexts. But the actual coding for the project was realized by Fred, a trained computer scientist, one of the other PhDs, who did most of his coding in Java. The code that was developed was not fixed into one setting, but evolved in algorithmic assemblages, as mentioned with the example of Stefan. The code structuring was guided by discussions within the group, coming from different perspectives and leveling out what actually could be realized in forms of computer code. It was enriched with snippets being found online at forums such as Stack Overflow, where others had posted solutions to the problems the project team faced, and it was before generative AI had coding. As a third person within the project team, maybe his name was David, started to code, these assemblages became even more liquid and fragmented. Code as an agent being spread over different laptops, coding languages, data sets, and of course different scripts that were written during the project, as well as in the context of the accompanying doctorate theses. Some of the code snippets were published at GitHub, others remained situated within individual storage devices. Since the project did not focus on software development, none of the code is likely to remain visible for a long time, and no infrastructure was developed out of the ideas conceptualized and modeled into code. All of its development was based on the testing the group did in joint sessions, as well as individual coding that was afterwards grouped, rearranged, and reworked together in subgroups. But code is again only one of different agents here. Without Andrea and the team, none of the code makes any sense, since they used it in order to solve small parts of the research questions they had. Small parts is important here. Most of the work was still done by humans. For example, annotations were attached to data in order to then use these annotations to deploy specific information from the data, such as the thematic focus, covered or the person's name and identity recognition. Without the human input, little of the code would be understandable for the project team and even less for others like us. The team, as a complete group, as smaller subgroups, as well as individually, was examining the code, the output it gave, and how to work with this in constant testing, in many aspects reformulating or extending code, as well as input data according to the first results they gained. Within this, not only code and the person programming did play a role, but also the devices and infrastructures being used, such as Jupyter notebooks, which they heavily used, the data taken into account and reshaped via the research, additional resources such as lexica or pre-trained models deployed, and the code implemented that others have beforehand produced. We could also set our lens to the cloud infrastructure of the university involved in some parts, or the project-specific reasons that came from funding logic. Depending on the scale we take to examine, the algorithmic assemblages at work here unfold more and more, as well as into different directions. They consist of liquid and fragmented elements, they are there already, formed and reformed not only for code and data sets, and they are already also forming and reforming epistemologies. Decision-making becomes a shared action of both the coding humans and the machines in interactions. Stefan only started to think about it when asked by me, and prior he reported that he took settings whenever they fitted the common statement within digital humanities. It is seldomly reflected what the impact on the findings or on visualizations are, but instead it is played with the settings and parameters until the result is plausible. Interpretation and analysis are inherent to the selection and combination of methods applied. Calculating rather is a form of testing than an intensive interpretation. The code stays messy. Andrea revises her code whenever she comes back to work she produced earlier on, not only because she advanced her skill set of programming in the meantime, but also because the goals she wants to achieve with the code change or advance. Therefore, she and others have numerous versions of their code written within their local storage devices or within repositories. As Daniel, PhD researcher from another project, points out, his code is never finished, even though he does not produce any software but models that should give him and others insight to large corpora. Testing approaches and tinkering can be found in all these practices all along the way. The implementation, this incompleteness creates frictions, tensions, and disruptions. Something is not working. Stefan is not the only one who adapts his Python scripts accordingly. Interpretation and analytical research therefore lie in particular in the selection and combination of this. procedures. But this becomes invisible once the testing is successful. As a result, for example, in a conference presentation, testing and tinkering are often packed into a few sentences or become completely invisible, even if they are very time-consuming and thought-intensive in research practices. Power and norms are evident here. Who programs what? Which ideas of testing do Stefan, Andrea, Fred, and others come up with? Which scripts are available? It all depends on knowledge, networks, and hierarchies. Based on these findings, it is necessary to investigate concrete scenarios of testing with a focus on longer-term ethnographic participation. Further development of ethnographic methods is also necessary in order to include the diverse entities and practices, such as code. By opening up the craft workshop and carrying out testing together, digital practices can be better understood. Digital practices also come into play in exploring unknown material. Previously unknown data is discovered within these practices. In times of generative AI, again, this is changing, but computational methods for exploring have been around for much longer. Computational methods, topic modeling, for example. This rather old-fashioned method is often used for exploring in digitally extended research processes. Not so much because it shows the latest developments in information technology, but because the results come close to human interpretation and human interpretation needs. The topic lists outputs are often easy to interpret. The basis is unsupervised machine learning. I don't think I have to tell you, it is assumed that each text contains certain topics that can be identified by frequently occurring words. Iterative steps divide all the words in the text into frequently occurring groups, which are referred to as topics. Here are some examples from a corpus of oral history interviews that seem to revolve thematically around work, and unfortunately these are in German, but translating them would change much of the meaning the words bring with them. But what changes with this perspective of data? If you have never looked into this transcript data set, what changes if we start here? So far, there are hardly any quality criteria for documenting digital practices. There are a lack of qualitative evaluations. However, processes of interpretation cannot be adequately mapped using quantitative methods or instruments such as inter-annotator agreements. For interpretative processes, memoing methods from qualitative methods, such as grounded theory, are suitable for exploring in digital practices across the board and documenting the steps involved. Dennis Möbus and I have developed an experimental approach to this. To find out how exploration and interpretation processes change, we compare topic modeling with qualitative annotation in workshop groups. Does it look like this, or like this, or like this? Process-oriented annotation, according to grounded theory, is typical for qualitative research that is often implemented digitally by hand. We use the CAPMA tool. In exploring with topic modeling, here implemented as LDA with method, we label lists of the terms assigned to topics in a Colab notebook used. We label those lists with analytical terms. We have implemented 2 workshops so far and worked with student groups in between. The first workshop group was heterogeneously composed of students, doctoral candidates, and postdocs, both with and without digital humanities connection. As this made it difficult to interpret the group processes, for the second workshop we have drawn on a more homogeneous group of digital humanities researchers. The workshop with researchers without digital humanities connections will follow in October. The participants explore the corpus of oral history interviews mentioned already, and we observe the discussions ethnographically and record them in parts, and we evaluate the annotations themselves. Within the first workshops, we formed 2 groups. One that first used topic modeling to access the aforementioned corpus of interview transcripts, and then did qualitative annotation based on grounded theory. and one that first did qualitative annotation and then looked at the outputs of topic modeling. Based on the results of this first workshop, we adapted the process to first exploring with topic modeling and then entering the manual qualitative annotation. Across the groups, our initial hypothesis from our autoethnographic experience was very much confirmed, that topic modeling can be used in particular to explore unknown material. So what does the use of such a method mean for the interpretive processes? How does exploring data change as a digital practice? Qualitative annotations are realized in digital manual work. Sorting of topics is realized by an algorithm. While the topics are fixed within when the interpretation of the LBA code are once completed, categories are only forming during the process of manual annotation, and this is different from the annotations you do in linguistic annotating, where you form a text at first. In both approaches, the participants agreed that meaning is attributed to humans, because, said one participant, they're just a list of words at first. The participants from the DH context, in particular, were aware that structures can be found using the procedure, but that these do not necessarily correspond to the human sense-making. They also emphasized even more strongly that the mixed group, that the creation of meaning would remain with the person who looks at the outputs of the procedure and interprets them. The question of sense-making leads us back to the question of distributed agency. The algorithmics of topic modeling influence the results of the analysis and structure the data. Human-technology relations are also at work in digital practices of exploring. Our evaluation of the annotations shows that the categories assigned to text passage hardly differ depending on which method you use. In topic modeling, processes and dynamics are captured less, as these do not appear as individual tokens immanent to the text, but they are manually coded out in the analysis. Accordingly, categories from the topics remain descriptive, whereas analytical categories are always formed in the manual annotation. In some cases, more analytical depth can be attributed to the manual assigned categories, but not to all of them. Exploring with different approaches therefore leads to comparable results. There are differences, but they are small. It is above all the people who perceive that computational exploration changes their cognitive processes. The engagement with the topics by jumping back and forth between the lists and terms shapes the expectation of text passages. One participant reported, and I quote, "There was a topic in which the city Bochum was frequently mentioned, and then we looked at it and found Herbert there too. That made me very happy for a moment, because I hoped that, yes, great, now we have a Herbert Grönemeyer topic." If you don't know Herbert Grönemeyer, it's a famous German musician who has an album named after his hometown Bochum, which was published in the 1980s. But this turned out to be a misinterpretation when exploring the actual text material. Grönemeyer does not appear as a token. There are simply many names within the topic. In the interview passages, people report on their environment, their friends, their family, the places they live. Another participant states accordingly, "I have labeled this topic as work colleagues or colleagues, friends somehow." Again and again, participants report that after viewing the topic modeling outputs, they develop a thesis that turns out to be wrong upon closer reading. Accordingly, the list of terms are also referred to as clues or structure. Our evaluation shows that interpretive exploration is therefore struggling. For the interpretation of text passages that were found using the results of topic modeling, contextual knowledge was often not necessary. So if you dive into an interview passage in the middle of a talk, to form basic information about the interviewer or the larger context of the text in order to be able to classify the narrated situations in it. And this is missing in computational exploring. In the study, we created laboratory situations that do not correspond to research contexts. You usually create a topic modeling yourself with a lot of testing involved, and we provided for the workshop a trained topic model. They only have the outputs and lists in order to start right away. And you usually explore the material much more intensively than you do within a 2 days workshop. This needs to be implemented by ethnographically accompanying ongoing research projects over the long term and reflecting together with the researchers doing the research on how digital practices change and what effect this has on epistemologies. When exploring with topic modeling, the general and the particular support each other based on the hermeneutics circle. According to one participant, it enables jumping between close and distance. Quantitative pre-structuring and qualitative fine analysis in combination enable new perspectives on large data sets. Nevertheless, some participants noted that the process can also lead you away from your own research question, that new perspectives open up rather than concrete material being found for your own question. Tinkering therefore relates to very fundamental epistemological aspects here that are simply tested in an exploring way and are often pressed into small lectures and projects that do not find the time to reflect on the consequences involved. In the best case, qualitative and quantitative perspectives enrich each other's. With Kitchen, this would be called a data-driven science, with Salvanic and empirical-driven theorizing. One participant remarked, "I don't have any hypothesis with the data. I have to bring them into the process. So I have to bring my own hypothesis." In contrast to Stefan, we suggest dealing with the actual research data in new constellations of exploring. Topic modeling is, of course, only one example of computational methods in digital practices, but much fails due to the lack of availability of infrastructures. As one participant notes, and I'm too fast there again, sorry, usability and epistemology go together. If we don't have tools that are usable, this has consequences for our interpretation process. So the methods and data used for or generated in testing and exploring require a third digital practice, infrastructuring. In this case, the handling and design of tools. This is because data cannot be methodologically understood without algorithms that describe and structure it, and therefore create infrastructures. This happens in research data management, in the retro-digitalization of archival material, and in the development of tools and scripts. Infrastructuring, with Susan Starr, attempts to transfer heterogeneous statements into categories. These standardizations and valorizations are powerful and, as imaginations, have an impact on the future research that can be realized with the infrastructures. The more plural and multimodal the data, the more complex the infrastructure. There are several dimensions of messy data and messy infrastructures involved. The specific infrastructures are often closely linked to the digital humanists who create and adapt systems, who therefore create infrastructure. In the process, norms are inscribed as well as social functions that influence the technical futures of research. Those who do not program by themselves, must rely on the functionality of tools, or as Sutton put it, they have to trust others to do the math. This is because the inherent power structures of algorithms are not visible when they are used. Critical questioning use is necessary. Here as well, humans and non-humans are entangled in the agency. I'm pointing what this looks like in concrete terms in and with the platform of experimental collaborative ethnography. Piece is being developed within ethnography, from the community, built for the community by the community. The piece group itself, at the same time, analyzes digital tools to the infrastructure in the infrastructuring consequences they have. Infrastructuring is therefore constantly being renegotiated and realized at the same time within this group. My research here is collaborative since I am an active member of the International Peace Design Group. There are several instances of the software. You here see the start pages from both the two largest infrastructures. We recently updated the security background, so now it's working again and it's stable again. The basic idea of this infrastructure follows a triptych. Sources, from our own research can be archived. It can be stored and enriched with standardized metadata. If you can see it here, it's too small. It's Dublin core in the background, and there's contributor metadata, so who puts this artifact on the platform, and there's source metadata, so who's on the picture, who did the picture, when did it take place, and so on. The sources can be published in the, it's the third one, sorry, published on the platform individually and in combination with each other, and in combination with analytical texts and other forms of data in multimodal essays, as the one you see on the right, and you can dive into more details of the essay like a kaleidoscope. And the third pillar of the triptychon is analyzing. You can select collaboratively select annotation questions you want to apply to the data that is in there, and then look at this annotations together, reform them, and build your analysis out of it. The piece group infrastructures the needs of ethnographic research. Here, a design group, ethnographers work to build what they need for their own digital practices and those of their community. As one member of the group put it, we are weaving alternatives into the system. It often are the seemingly boring details that are inscribed and continuously being inscribed into infrastructures anew that represent the underlying knowledge structures. Even though the concept of tinkering does not actually fit in with the long-term perspective of infrastructuring, those are continuously being realized through tinkering when building digital infrastructures, since technological development is rapid and the goal is only defined along the way, as we can see in research data management, for example. This is explicitly problematized in the piece group. We are infrastructuring the uninfrastructural because we are developing rules and structures for ethnographic research processes that are actually very open and flexible. The sources are fleeting, but they need to be fixed here in their form and their interpretation, but in a form that is as diverse, changeable, and jointly workable as possible. Tools are never theory neutral and always linked to the methods and questions that are being used and applied. That is why we create our own infrastructure, as many others do. We are currently working with the German-speaking group to systematize our specific needs for the platform, for example, with regard to GDPR, and we'll set up our own instance hopefully soon. This will help determine my infrastructure work over the next years, and the German instance will have an impact on the ethnographic research community and far beyond, because the combination of perspectives and digital practices at piece is unique. But computational methods will be further integrated into the infrastructures in order to combine indexing and analysis, which has proven to be effective in exploring. In addition, this is closely linked to method development and curation-driven approaches, as well as research data reuse in computational regards. Such translations are always characterized by the positioning of the researchers and are every time they are fragmented. As here with the photo documentation of the film recording, the position is relevant for what is handed on. There are always only individual data snippets. Creating infrastructure, so on the photo you see three perspectives of the same situation. Creating infrastructure becomes more important in digital practices because contexts should remain as easily and accessible as possible. Positionings must be linked together and fragmentation avoided wherever possible. At the same time, infrastructuring is always integrated into human-technology relationships again. Tools and infrastructures are in the making, always unfinished and often inadequate for the ways we want to use them. It is essentially to critically reflect on digital applications, their methodology, and effects in order to further develop infrastructure in a targeted manner. And that brings me to critical reflexive perspectives. Three perspectives will, in my perspective, be particularly relevant regarding digital practices in the future. It is necessary to combine the application and development of computational methods with theoretically and empirically based reflection on digital practices, their methods and effects for research. The central digital practices I presented today are testing as tinkering or thinkering, which enables methodological innovations, exploring of unknown sources in order to gain access to and within data, and infrastructuring as a design of tools for research. Digital practices are unfinished, and generative AI is important in their further development. The easily usable outputs in almost natural language hold enormous opportunities for new digital practices. Testing is omnipresent in using large language models within digital humanities at the moment. The many machine-generated outputs must be reinterpreted by humans. This is where critical reflection, again, becomes particularly central, because the black box is further closed when testing, exploring, and infrastructuring is delegated to a machine. At the same time, new practices emerge, because on another level, testing, exploring, and infrastructuring is possible in different regards with AI approaches. Analyzing and shaping the use of generative AI as a digital practice at the same time is needed. Human-technology relations are central to the realization of digital practices. Without thinking people, no relevant scientific results can be produced. In order to examine the interplay between humans and technology, there are a number of theoretical strands. It is about translations that become necessary differently. The boundaries and materialities of researchers and their fields are becoming renegotiated. In the process, norms such as regulations and standardizations have an effect. Existing and new power structures determine who can realize research with data, with which methods and tools. Accessibility and also competencies that co-determine knowledge production are relevant, especially in trust and mistrust perspectives. And new digital practices are constantly developing in assemblages in more than human structures within distributed ownership. I'm quite sure you have a different perspective on what digital humanities contains, what parts it is. This is one of my structuring attempts in order to say what is included in digital humanities: computational methods, digital and retro-digitized data, infrastructures, resources, but also digital manual work and basic digital skills. When we look at digital humanities with expertise from cultural anthropology, we ask about relations, about meanings and processes, about situated practices of scientific work as it manifests itself in and with the age. Research and society are intertwined as a result and condition of social actions and in ongoing negotiation. The age itself can be understood as an assemblage, just like what is understood by digital methods, as relations of different entities with open edges and unclear attributions in the process of being created and in constant change. This assemblage currently often lacks perspectives on plural sense-making and ambiguities, on empirical and qualitative research, and on the associated particularities and needs. Scientific knowledge, such as that relating to methods, data, infrastructures, and resources, is integrated into practices and norms. The DH has long since created its own communities of practice, which have established forms of communication as well as bodies of knowledge and positioning within the community. Through learning participation in the community, knowledge is constantly being reconstructed and translated into practices. Communities of practice, such as the Digital Humanities or the BHD-Verband, become entrenched. The often regulated access only enables learning and participation in the group. Testing, exploring, and infrastructuring are important practices within this community. Despite all the experimenting and tinkering, we must not forget that power structures are acting here as well. This becomes particularly clear at the level of infrastructure and resources. This is where a basis for social order is created that disciplines the entities involved. So basically us as digital humanities researchers as well. What is in between the categories? Hybrid, heterogeneous, not fitting, and not unambiguous, or what is ambiguous, can be made the starting point for analysis and further development. Infrastructures are created and used in the DH, which in turn refer to the community of practice with which they interact. But it is not enough to develop the technical infrastructures. They must be integrated into everyday practices, enable practices and routine, and in turn limit them. They always limit them. But not only infrastructures are part of power knowledge complexes. We must also question the data that is analyzed in and with these infrastructures using computational methods in algorithmic assemblages with corresponding cultural scientific readings. That data is never as clean and unambiguous as it seems, for example, as a published data set. The often very hard work of data cleaning is not simple. The concept of cleaning already revealed the power, because who is actually cleaning what here? Data is incomplete, often broken, and its structures do not always fit together since it is messy. Reflexive digital humanities therefore take these perspectives into account, as well as it goes on with the development of computational methods, the work on data sets, infrastructures, and resources. It cannot be realized without digital handwork and teaching, as well as questioning the basic digital skills. Digital humanities should therefore become more self-reflexive, questioning one's own digital practices and their effects. Early and ongoing reflection within research projects regarding the epistemological change with and through changing digital practices is essential. So I close with: how do processes, documentation, and results change our research practices? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. So, you mentioned a lot of important things, and I did feel called out at certain points, which is great. So, I am thinking. You've mentioned a lot of things that we have to do.
Yeah.
And
sorry.
It's really great to focus on this epistemological processes and things like that. But because we often do not, what would you say is maybe a good starting point?
For whom?
Well, maybe for students. At this point?
Maybe start with documentation and start writing down what you actually do in testing, exploring infrastructure. Not only think about the results, but really document the steps you do in between, because you then get a sense of what you're actually doing and where you take decisions you are not aware of.
Okay, I can ask other questions, but does anybody has questions?
Thank you very much for your talk. It was very important to reflect. I've been thinking about this a lot, about this documentation process and how sometimes it doesn't make sense, the results that you see in a paper, and you can't find any code or any documentation, and you just believe that the person did that. It's a little bit weird. Do you think that this reflection is about digital humanities in Germany or in other countries in general?
Actually, I can't give you a broad picture on digital humanities worldwide, especially because I've been doing qualitative research. But I mean, there are quite a lot of books and articles on like critical digital humanities. But in my opinion, those actual practices are often very less combined with this critical reflexive perspective. So maybe you read a book or a paper about it, but then you go on with your practices and you have it in the back of your mind, but actually including it into your daily work, I think a lot of digital humanists don't do, and they don't even think about this might be necessary because we are so trained to put results out there and have even smaller projects than other humanities or social science have. But actually most of the digital humanists are trained in a classical humanities discipline. So we all have the background knowledge. So we all know power concept by Foucault. We heard about that. But combining this, I don't think it's often realized, and I assume it's like this, at least the international perspective I am aware of.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So firsthand, I noticed how important the traditions of the different disciplines are. For example, for historians, the hermeneutic approach is the major thing. For social sciences, you're more familiar with experimenting. So a historian won't do experiments if the German funding tells him so. So let's say in reconstructing monuments of the past, we develop paradata as an important structure to document your decisions during the process of building the model. The same is true for all other things. So here in Göttingen, we're very proud of, or very keen on using paradata with every project. So my first question would be, how can paradata be formalized that you could have a quantitative approach on the quality of the data? Something that we are always looking for in our fields. But I can expect, so since, let's say, how interviews should be made and other approaches that has a long tradition in your field, it must be possible to have, let's say, a certain structure of paradata that allows you to let's say, test how good the quality of the process was.
I mean, this is exactly infrastructuring the uninfrastructural, because qualitative data never is structured. You always have to add metadata and paradata only to structure it. That's why research data management for qualitative data is a mess, because it's another project phase you need for structuring the data. And most of the researchers don't want to do it because it's very sensitive material. So I think this is really a hard question. And I agree, we need paradata and we need structured information. So documenting is not everything. You need to account for how to document it. With a colleague out of the University of Hagen, I'm thinking about a database in order to put your information into to document. You can even link it with your Jupyter notebook and have, like, every time you do something there, you have an entry into your database while you're doing it. But of course, then it's free text again, unstructured text. There we back we are. So you can go in infinite circles, I think, because you could then do like all of this quantitative methods on the unstructured data you produce in documenting what you're actually doing. I think another dimension is adjusting metadata standards. We are at the moment working in a project with Lido, CIDO-3RM standard, and there are relations within it, but you can't qualify the relations in the way we want to qualify it. And of course, I can now work on my infrastructure and implement it in my database, but then I cannot put it into the linked semantic web we want to put it in. So then it comes back to like political work, going to the Lido working group and telling them, hey, we need this, could you please change the standard? And of course, this is not done with just, I pick up the phone and tell them to do it, but it's work years. But I think this is another important thing, and this is true for paradata in general. I mean, we just talked about colonial context in data, we should label this with paradata as well. And whether you do it with qualification of relations or somehow differently, it needs to be standardized in order to stay visible when the data is moving. But it's a very broad topic we can do research on for years.
So I guess your answer is really, let's say, typical. So you don't need a new leader standard, you need Paradata for later. And coming back to it, I guess Stefan was his name, who said that constructing a database is already a research thing. So it is not to fill fields with information, but to model these fields, to think about what belongs to this field and what to the other, is something that the LIDO scheme needs. So 20 years ago, it was really innovative to think from the events and not from the object to model cultural artifacts. And now it must be, as you said, I completely agree. It must be the, let's say, the tinkering how to model these events and these words and these terms, fields, and so on. Yeah. But you can't find. I guess it's not possible to have common, let's say, standards in describing objects. That is not possible. I would be happy if we would use all the same terms in certain, let's say, practices or certain occasions.
Yeah, I mean, because there is so much interpretation in the terms we use. Of course, you can say, okay, this is a table. We all use the same term for that. But when it comes to interpretation, terms are heavily loaded with disciplinary history and lines of thought you are into. So you can't find, and then you can't label it with a definition you once put into an ISO standard and then there, and it's in a controlled vocabulary. That's impossible. But I mean, don't get me wrong. Of course, digital humanists are doing this modeling work, and it's a lot of intellectual work they do. But it often becomes invisible once it's done. It's inscribed into the metadata standards, but we also do this on smaller scale than developing or redeveloping metadata standards. But we don't often document this. We don't document it while doing it, but we also don't document it when writing about our research. It's really often one sentence. I did topic modeling and 70 topics both best fitted my research question. Done. How did we come to this? Why? And for my PhD students, I pushed them to write one article about this, about their, and you have to write it at the end, but you have to document it all the way along, about why did I use which methods, how did I combine it, which methods did I try out and they didn't work. So reflecting on this should be part of our research culture, of our community of practice.
Definitely. And that doesn't fit in 8 pages papers.
Yeah.
That is the other problem.
Yes. Yeah, but okay, but then write an 8 pages paper about that and quote it in the other papers you write.
Yeah, but then it would be not deep enough to really explain the problem.
Yeah, depends on the level of abstraction you have in the paper. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Or thoughts you have, or disagree.
Yeah, I could always ask. Another thing that comes to your mind is that categories are forming themselves during research, if I understood you correctly. And I thought, is this something that came with the digital data, or is there, let's say, a longer tradition in doing so? And so, well, let's say a parallel structure is this third-party funding, where you need to write a proposal, but you already know what comes out of it to have a good result in the end. And now that the third party recognizes this, and actual funding lines say, do more experimenting with the data, try out new methods, just give you more free space in your research, because they already noticed this problem. But then we're doing, let's say, even more experiments and less argumentation in this thing, in saying we want to try out and improve and so on. So I'm asking myself if this idea of the Gedanken experiment, which is older than digital data, is one of the lines for the let's say, bad situation we are in humanities. Now, or we were, let's say, 10 years ago, when we were all talking about this problem.
Yeah, maybe, I mean, basically, isn't the Gedanken experiment connected to models? But I would have to think about this further on. But first, I want to say, for categories when they emerge, I think this is very discipline specific, or the line of interpretation you follow. Actually, I wrote a paper with Heike Zinsmeier and Koch about the different forms of annotations, because there are process-oriented annotations and product-annotated annotations, product-oriented annotations, we put it. For linguistics, Heike Zinsmeier says linguist, you always have this product-oriented annotations. You see, like, you want to find all entities within a text. And you have a list of categories of text that you produce beforehand, and then you test it, and you maybe adjust it, but then you have like tons of people annotating, and then inter-annotator agreement totally makes sense for seeing whether this fitted. But looking at all kinds of qualitative or hermeneutic interpretation, I mean, the hermeneutic circle, it goes further to the context is much more and more. In grounded theory, you jump back and forth all the time, go back into your material, see what is there, form a new category, go back and add some material. So this concept of corpus is totally different, and the same is to say for this concept of forming categories, because they only emerge with your research, and you don't start dumb, but you start with only basic knowledge about your research thematic focus, and you become an expert while working through the material, because the level of questions you ask is different, which is not a hierarchy thing. So I would say it is the other way around. Categories stabilize more within the digital. The more digital your work, your research work is, the more you need to stabilize your categories. If you read a text, no matter whether it's a scientific literature or an interview transcript I have, and you read it on paper, you can scribble something down, mark it, do something with your pen. If you do it in a PDF document, or in CAPMA, you always have to be very precise on what you do. You can't do like put two lines between something that is very important, but it's much more stable and limited in the possibilities you have. But it's more standardized, so you can more easily compare it. So, but this emerging categories, I mean, there is specialized software for qualitative data analysis. It's all companies running it. It's very expensive if you want to buy it individually, and they don't want to open up, of course, because it's a business model where you can form flexible categories, move it through your text, rename it, group it, and things like that. But I think it depends on the disciplinary background and the research question you want to answer with that.
So, any other questions? Comments? Okay.
Maybe I ask a question to the students. What do you think, what are your most basic digital practices you perform when doing digital humanities? I talked about some, but maybe you have different practices in mind that are important.
Building corpus, making a plan of it, how to do it, or first thing I start on.
So you're making a plan of how to.
How to.
So you're modeling.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Most of us are modeling.
Most of you are modeling, okay. Anybody who does something else?
Where are the shape comparison? So comparison is another thing we
Okay.
often do. And with AI, that's why I'm just interested in categories. We have the problem that classes don't fit to categories and vice versa, because the semantic and the formal thing is different. And so some of the students work in these fields to see how could formal classes become semantical categories.
I would be interested in the results. Okay.
Yeah, I think I would say here we have some good practices of thinking first of what you want to achieve, and then think about your digital practice, maybe. I think this is something that we do here. What do we want to achieve? And then we go after our digital practice.
So we always start with research questions. That's my most important topic to teach. And therefore some categories must be clear, or some ideas must be clear in the beginning. And so we try to avoid looking at big data without any question. But the distant viewing, close viewing, distant viewing, close viewing, distant reading, close viewing, is a kind of experimenting, of course. And this, looking to the results, starting new questions, doing new tests, and so it is something we do as well, of course.
So, but how to look into data without a research question? And you basically, you for sure asked this question already. If you don't have a research question, you can't. How can you look into data? You just see for the structures.
Yeah, no. Yeah. So it is very common, and we do. I do this sometimes for have, let's say, good examples for teaching. That I'm just taking some data from somewhere and see what I could do with it. That was typical in the 2010 years of digital humanities. And then see if there is a result. That's what I'm asking, if they sometimes do the same with research funding or with other things, that we will ask our questions later, just by looking at the data and see what comes out of it.
I cited Rob Kitchen, who coined the term data-driven science, and I think that's exactly what you're talking about. But he refers to, and he talks about digital humanities and computational social science, and he refers to, like, there are two directions of data-driven science. You can't go into a data set blind. Then it would be the end of theory, like Chris Anderson put it in the early 2000s. You don't need theory, it all comes from the data. But like looking for structures that are there and then reiterating the research question, the broad perspective, you choose a data set. So you have a broader perspective you want to do research on at first, otherwise you would have to choose randomly. But this, like, interacting with the data and then so turning it's basically it's inductive reasoning, not having a research question and then nailing it down whether your hypotheses are true, but formulating hypotheses out of the research data you have.
So indeed, this close viewing, distant viewing, close reading, distant viewing, distant reading is an important thing for most of digital humanities scholars, and it depends how you start. You could start from, let's say, a qualitative approach, looking through some examples of your data and form a hypothesis from there, or say doing some calculations that bring you a hypothesis and then look closer if this can be true.
Yeah, this is what we did in the workshops I talked about. We tried to, like, look at the practices people have when starting with calculation or starting with a snippet and going qualitative, starting qualitative. Actually, the interpretation didn't differ much. The difference was in the human expectations that were connected with the start they had into the material. They had more analytic categories passed on, and you can't get analytical categories like with controlled vocabularies. You don't find gender in an interview. You don't find this term because people, when they talk about care work and things like that, they don't say it's gendered, but they most of the time use different words. So you have to find the words to have your analytical perspective on it. So, but yeah, the perspectives didn't differ much, but the perception of it differs very much. Whether you start with close or distant reading and how you intermingle it. Okay.
So thank you very much again.
Thank you very much for the discussion and the invitation.